In 1969, the famous French film director Jean-Luc Godard formed, with his collaborator Jean-Pierre Gorin, a Dziga Vertov group, a collective group for their filmmaking projects. When Godard was asked in 1970 why Dziga Vertov, he replied, "Because at the beginning of the century he was really a Marxist movie maker. He was a revolutionary working for the Russian Revolution through the movies. He wasn't just an artist, he was a progressive artist who joined the revolution and became a revolutionary artist through struggle. He said that the task of a film worker was not movie making, but to produce films in the name of the world proletarian revolution." Now, give or take a few details, that statement by Godard is broadly true in terms of who Dziga Vertov was and what he was on about. Now, this film, Man with a Movie Camera, from 1929, is an incredibly potent film. I don't just mean it's a dynamic and quite dazzling piece of filmmaking. I mean that this film, in a way that very few films do, gives us a really full picture of a whole world in motion. So much so that it's the kind of film that inspires you. It certainly inspires a certain kind of nostalgia. You look at this film and you say, wow, that Soviet revolution of 1917, the October Revolution, really gave us something incredible. Like, this was amazing, this fusion of art and life, this dynamism, all of this energy. And then, of course, a few moments later, you remember the rest of the history of Russian communism, and in fact of communism throughout the 20th century in many countries, and you wonder where that dream went. You also might wonder how much of Man with a Movie Camera is true, in the sense of, is what it's showing, is what it evokes, how true was it to the world at that time that Vertov was living in. Now, these two sides of the question of Man with a Movie Camera, on the one hand, it's a utopia, it's a dream. And on the other hand, there's the reality, the worst realities of the 20th century. And these two sides have haunted, I think, every discussion, every debate about Man with a Movie Camera. Because we either say that the film embodies a utopian dream that is really worth something, or we say that the film somehow had the bad seed in it of what communism in Russia and elsewhere was to become. So keep that question in your mind as we begin to go through the film. Now, what kind of film is Man with a Movie Camera? There are many kinds of descriptions you can give it. It's been called a city symphony. In more recent years, it's been called a database film because it's made up of so many fragments. It's like something we could edit in the digital age of the 21st century. What I call it above all else is a montage film. It's a film constructed in editing. And I mean the editing of one piece with the next, but then the building of those pieces, of those shots, into what Vertov thought of as montage phrases, sort of larger blocks or sequences of montage, until finally we've got the whole film constructed as an incredible montage block. So on the small scale and on the large scale, this is an incredible film about editing, and we're going to look at a number of aspects of that. Already you're getting a sense from the film of how vibrant its relations are. Things are edited both for their graphic or visual quality, the angles of things, the change from one shot to the next, the light and darkness, all of these contrasts playing from shot to shot. And then, of course, we have the rhythmical and sometimes the metrical editing of the shots, meaning, how long they go for, but also what speed they go at and the speed of what it is that's being shown in the image. This film is, of course, a silent film. There have been many attempts to to do live music accompaniment, and some of that has been put onto various editions of the film. But originally it was a silent movie, and it stands for a certain ideal of visual music, of a film that even in its silence can evoke all sorts of musical relations and rhythmic relations, in fact very, very complex ones. And it's important to look at this film, as well as with any accompaniment, musical accompaniment that you can experience with it. It's good to also experience it purely as a silent film. Now, at the very start of the movie, there was a series of titles where the film announces, in a sense, that it's a documentary, that it's a film purely of what Vertov called film facts. It is not a fiction film. It is not a scripted film. It is a film, in some sense, free of artifice. This is the way the film presents itself. Now, in fact, there's quite a bit of artifice in this film, and on many levels. The scene that we're seeing right now, the woman who in fact was a dancer, her name was Valia Anastasieva. She wakes up in the morning, she gets up, she washes. Of course, this is staged scenes. It's a mise-en-scène as careful as in any fiction film. Vertov wasn't against creativity. In fact, he was all for artistry, for the role of the artist. And as Godard said, to be a revolutionary artist. However, what's fascinating about Vertov and his collaborators, whom I'll mention further on, is that they were working in an incredibly creative way, departing from documentary. Yes, they were filming real things, for instance, the homeless people asleep on the street and so on. They were filming all manner of these film facts, these facts of the world, these phenomena and experiences, and of course ordinary people out in the streets and so on. But in fact, they were using a great deal of artistry, of creativity, both in the framing of shots, in the cinematography. The main cameraman is Mikhail Kaufman, and he is indeed the man with the movie camera, the person that you're seeing in all sorts of amazing positions and angles and places and states during the film. That's Mikhail Kaufman, who was in fact Dziga Vertov's brother. Dziga Vertov was born David Kaufman, later Dennis Kaufman, and then he changed his name to Dziga Vertov, which literally means spinning top, because it was a sort of constructivist symbol. It was a symbol of dynamism and energy and productivity and play together. Because when we think of a spinning top, it's not just a machine. It's also something that has an excess, a sense of fun about it. And this is very much part of the film, is to bring all of that together, sort of productivity and fun. Anyhow, Mikhail Kaufman is the man with a movie camera, and he shot much of the film. But there's also, of course, somebody filming the man with a movie camera. There's a second man with a movie camera, and that was Peter Zotov, who is not credited in the film. Now, even that, talking about there's a man with a movie camera, but then, of course, there's another man who films the man with a movie camera, another person filming that, might make you think about how Vertov was taken up in one of the several waves of him being rediscovered, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, with not only people like Godard and Goran and their Dziga Vertov group, but also a lot of experimental filmmakers who were very inspired by this film when they discovered it, as it were, in the 1960s and 70s. This film, which is working with the film frame, where Vertov and his collaborators are literally counting the number of frames and constructing these extraordinary rhythms and sequences of fragments of footage. This was an inspiration to filmmakers who, some of them called themselves the structural materialists. They were concerned with the materials of the film, of the celluloid, of the film frame, and so on. So this is another aspect of Vertov's legacy, not only a political vision of a perfect world or a new world, but also a sort of a filmic vision, a vision of working with film materials. Now, let's hear a bit from Dziga Vertov himself and the Council of Three. Now, the Council of Three was Dziga Vertov, his wife, Yelizaveta Svilova, and that's the editor, that's the woman who we see editing the film, which comes up pretty soon, and Mikhail Kaufman, the cinematographer. This is from a 1922 manifesto that the Council of Three wrote called We. We proclaim the old films based on the romance, theatrical films and the like to be leprous. Keep away from them. Keep your eyes off them. They're mortally dangerous, contagious. We affirm the future of cinema art by denying its present. Cinematography must die so that the art of cinema may live. We call for its death to be hastened. We protest against the mixing of the arts, which many call synthesis, the mixture of bad colours, even those ideally selected from the spectrum, produces not white but mud. Synthesis should come at the summit of each art's achievement and not before. We are cleansing cinema of foreign matter, of music, literature and theatre. We seek our own rhythm, one lifted from nowhere else, and we find it in the movements of things. We invite you to flee the sweet embraces of the romance, the poison of the psychological novel, the clutches of the theatre of adultery, to turn your back on music, to flee out into the open, into 4 dimensions, 3 plus time, in search of our own material, our meter and rhythm. Today, Man with a Movie Camera is an object of study. It's a film that's shown and broken down in film schools everywhere, film training schools. Critics, analysts, theorists have looked at it. It's used in many live performance events. It's the basis of digital art projects on the internet. But something I really want you to bear in mind is that when Vertov made this film, in a way he knew it might only be seen once, perhaps if at all, but sort of ordinary Russian film goers may only get a chance to see it once. And he designed it for a once-only viewing, in a sense. Although that wasn't its subsequent destiny, we can enjoy it in a different way now. But in 1929, this film sort of had a dual aim. It was an incredibly ambitious film because, firstly, it was trying to convince its audience and also the Russian bureaucracy of government and arts that cinema, that film, was just as much a part of the revolution and much a part of industry as any other kind of industry. That it was a form of labour, it was a form of work and so on. It wasn't just either just a reflection of what was going on in the world, as in the social realism that became sort of the rule in Russian cinema under Stalin, and nor was it just a bit of diversion, a bit of entertainment, a bit of relaxation or recreation for the masses between their working days. Vertov really wanted to stress that film is work on par with all forms of work. And there's a big importance in the fact that, literally the man with the movie camera has to crank his camera, in these silent cinema days. He's really got to work that damn thing. Of course, all cinematography is work, but this is visible work. And Vertov pledged himself, in a sense, to the visible world. He said that, the cinema records the visible world and brings out the poetry of the visible world. Okay, I'd like to introduce here the beginnings of a simple lesson about editing, and we'll make this a bit more complicated later. Say we're watching a film, any old film, and there's a shot of a man running in a field, and then we cut to a bird in flight, and then we cut back to the man running through the field. Now, if we had to put that in words, if we had to phrase that linguistically, we might say, this man is like a bird. We'd use an analogy, a simile of some sort, or we'd use a metaphor. We'd say, man, the bird, man is a bird, right? Now, in cinema, and particularly in Vertov's cinema, in the way that when Vertov edits two things together, he's not using that kind of hierarchy where we use one thing sort of to bring out the qualities of another thing. We're using the qualities of a bird to bring out the qualities of a human being. When Vertov cuts from one thing to another, he wants to put them on the same level. This is an idea we'll come back to because it's a very complex and structuring idea of the whole of man of the movie camera. But let's just say for the moment that he's more interested in just sort of documenting the correspondences, the echoes, the thing that unites two different objects, two different people, two different activities that he puts together, and that he rejects this hierarchy of one thing being used as a metaphor for another thing. It's one of the things that Vertov disliked in the work of Eisenstein, this kind of recourse to a more literary or linguistic form of metaphor. Now, I mentioned that, Vertov had one chance to win his audience and to teach his audience, and he was trying to teach them, to persuade them that firstly, film is part of the Industrial Revolution. And remember, this is a film that's very much caught up with the 5-year plan, and the 5-year plan, which gets an explicit reference later in the film, is this period of industrialisation, where Russia is moving away from an agrarian economy into a more industrial one. So on the one hand, he wants film to be accepted as part of the 5-year plan, but he also is trying to educate the senses, and I mean, particularly the vision, but the vision linked to the mind. He's trying to educate the senses. A scholar I'll refer to later, John McKay, refers to how he literally wanted his audience to sort of come up to speed with the new rhythms of a new industrialised world, a machine world. And he would do that through cinema. This film, will sort of teach you how to see better. This was a constant theme in Vertov's writing, in the writings of the Council of Three. And when you look at the film this way, I mean, it's an amazing attempt to, in 67, 68 minutes, kind of turn your head around, literally, to make you see, to make you feel, to make you process things in a new way. And this was really the ambition, and certainly part of the utopian ambition of the film. Now, when we talk about this education of the senses, it brings up once again this very sensitive area of the way people regard this film, and this duality that I spoke about before between sort of utopia and horror when we look at the whole history of communism in particular. Now, one of the things about Man with a Movie Camera that sometimes riles people, that can get people really worked up, is this evocation of the machine, and in a sense of the human being as a machine, or as the band Kraftwerk would put it many years later, the man-machine, the machine-man. And John McKay, who I've mentioned, sort of devotes his work to trying to refute this idea that Vertov was only about sort of the making machine of the human being, and of this complete 100% industrialisation of the human body, of the human senses. Now, there are things in Vertov's writing that would give you this sometimes awful sense of the ideology of the new man, the perfect human being, the perfectible human, which is, of course, one of the least attractive aspects of Soviet ideology. Of course, it also crosses over with the eugenics of Nazi ideology and every rotten ideology you can think of, this idea that the human being is going to be perfected by a new social system. Now, this is another passage from the Vertov and Council of Three text. Our path leads through the poetry of machines, from the bungling citizen to the perfect electric man, in revealing the machine's soul, in causing the worker to love his workbench, the peasant his tractor, the engineer his engine. We introduce creative joy into all mechanical labour. We bring people into closer kinship with machines. We foster new people. The new man, free of unwieldiness and clumsiness, will have the light, precise movements of machines, and he will be the gratifying subject of our films. Presumably also the gratified subject to see himself or herself reflected in this way. Of course, we're watching reflections right now in the film. And that brings us to one of the key kind of notes of this idea of the human and the machine man, the man machine, which is precisely the kino eye, the film eye, the cinema eye, the cine eye, let's call it, as a translation of kino eye. And of course, this is a major image in Man with a Movie Camera. We have the camera itself with its lens, which is like an eye. We have, of course, literally an eye superimposed on the lens of the camera. We've had a moment earlier in the film where the woman waking, her blinking, is corresponded to the lens, the shutter of the camera, and the black frames that sort of interrupt the image are also made to correspond with a human eye. Now, Vertov often made this point that the human being, the human vision, was limited. It was poor in some respects, impoverished, whereas the camera eye is the thing that could be perfected. It could be endlessly perfected. It could be made to do the most extraordinary things that the human eye could not do. And in a way, the whole of Man with a Movie Camera is devoted to demonstrating this, that, the camera eye can, climb anything, as long as the man with a movie camera is sort of strong enough and a great enough sort of labourer, adventurer, that he can climb anything and go anywhere and brave anything to record. But what's important here is that the cine eye, the camera, is not just a mechanical apparatus for Vertov. It's not simply the thing that records reality, which impresses itself with light on the celluloid. That you'll read that kind of idea in other film theories, the theories of Jean Epstein, the theories of Andre Bazin. They all played with this idea that the camera was a mechanical recording of reality that impressed itself onto the film. In Vertov, though, it's quite a different thing. Really, he was dreaming of this sort of fusion of the eye and the camera. That's precisely what his cinema expresses and what this film expresses particularly. And that then, through watching the montage of all this material into the form that it takes here, our eye and our mind's eye would be further made to evolve. We would have a richer view. Now, in this moment of the film, we've got this absolute celebration of movement, and now look at this. Fantastic switch. Freeze frame introduces a new montage phrase, a new sequence, a new set of associations. The whole of Man with a Movie Camera is done with associational editing. One thing always suggests another. It corresponds to the next thing. Now, what freezing the image, of course, brings in to the sequence that we hadn't had previously is editing itself. It's often been said by the editor and editing theorist Karen Perlman, by the artist Hito Steylerl, that the film could be called, perhaps it should be called, The Woman at the Editing Table rather than The Man with a Movie Camera. Now, I don't think necessarily the original film and the original Russian language was making such a big gender deal about it's men who have movie cameras, but it's clear that there are different genders have different kinds of labours in the film. They're given different labours, different jobs to do, and as is true of the film industry in many countries and in many times, editing has often been a woman's job in the cinema industry. It's a very strange business in many ways, but it seems to fit this cultural stereotype of woman as the backroom nurturer and so on, who puts it all together and holds the thing together. However, put that aside, I mean, the film is a fantastic celebration of the power of editing and of the power of the editor herself, as we said, is Vertov's wife. And here, all of the imagery that we've had so far of the film, of movement, of things passing each other, of coming together, of separating, which is going to go in another direction soon. Now all of this is linked very directly to filmmaking, to editing. There's photography, and then there's the collection of all of the pieces of footage. As we'll see, there's an incredible sort of archive, library, stacking, cataloguing, inventory thing which Yelizaveta's got going in the editing room here. And that in itself is like an industrial organisation of the world. It itself is part of the movement of industrialisation in the film. Now, the literal movements in film editing, there's spinning reels, there's, the cutting, the joining. This links up to, literally 100 other things in the film, 100 other things that are separated and joined. Numerous things that spin, just like this door right now. Now, this sort of brings up, once again, the duality in the way people talk about Vertov. One film critic who had, I think, quite an ambivalent attitude towards Vertov was the great British critic Raymond Dernier. And he never missed an opportunity to critique what he thought was a naive celebration of Vertov, particularly in this period from the 1960s, 1970s onwards. He saw it as a sort of a very naive kind of neo-Marxism in film studies that he personally opposed. And he said that, Vertov's film was a Stakhanovite, meaning an industrialising fragmentation of elements, which he, Dernier, opposed to Eisenstein, who said Eisenstein was all about emotion, about homages to emotionality, whereas Vertov for him is something more constructivist in the bad sense, precisely the cult of the machine, of the human made into a fragmented and then reconstructed machine. And Dernier said that the people who celebrated the film when they discovered it in the 1960s and 70s prized it for particular things, for what he called alienation and deconstruction. Alienation in the sense of we're always being reminded in an alienation effect that we're watching a film, we're always seeing the camera and the reflection of the camera and so on. And deconstruction, of course, because the film is in many ways putting things together, pulling them apart and then re-putting them together in another way, in another combination. The film does this many times and in many ways. However, Dernier at another more positive moment celebrated Vertov's work for its, quote, joyous openness to a dynamic semantic. Now, what that means is precisely that things, elements, fragments, can mean many things, and they can mean many things when they are put in relation to other things. And that is a very open-ended, multiple, indeed joyous dynamic process. That's really what I see more in Man with a Movie Camera today than the alienation, deconstruction sort of machine ideology. Now, we've entered a part of the film here which is devoted to the cycle of life. Death, birth, death, marriage, separation of couples, of married couples. We have all these things in a very strange order, right? It isn't a linear, birth, marriage, death sequence at all. It's totally kind of mixed up in an incredible way, back and forth between these poles of birth, death, separation, and so on. And once you've got those words or those ideas or those themes in place, each one of them migrate out and associate with all sorts of other things in this part of the film and in other parts of the film. Because it's not just a film you watch in a linear way, right? This is what Lev Manovich meant when he called the film a database film. In other words, you could put the pieces in another order. I rather like Vertov's order myself, but one could reorder the film and still be playing with this joyously open and dynamic semantic. Now, for instance, right, separation, right? There are people separating. There are people getting divorced in a sort of divorce and marriage registrar in this sequence of the film. But there are also like trams that are meeting and separating. There are all sorts of movements in the street, doorways. There's an ubiquitous doorway in this film through which the man with the movie camera exits at the start of his working day. And the film is full of these places where people cross paths, where they come together, where they split apart. And the film is also full of what we could call switching circuits, literally, road signs that switch the direction of the traffic. There are all sorts of movements that switch from one direction to another. This is a very literal illustration of an idea that Vertov often talked about, which is precisely to do with joining different movements, different motions, and changing them too. When you put them together, you send things off in a different direction. The whole film, as a montage film, is devoted to this process of putting things into play, putting things into motion, switching the direction, changing the energy of things. So in this sequence, which is devoted to the cycle of life, it starts in a sense as a sort of a cliche birth to death thing, but ends up being, like everything else in the film, this like an enormously open-ended poem about, once again, the whole symphony of the city and its multitude. Now here's a beautiful example of this literal kino eye idea. Now the camera is compared to an eye, to the movements of the eye, but of course there are also movements that the camera can do that the eye can't do. But Vertov is not putting these into a hierarchy. In fact, the faster the editing gets, the more it seems that they're the one thing. And this idea of fusion is something that we're going to come back to. Now, Man with a Movie Camera is the film that brings together, you could say, modernism as an art movement, particularly the Russian avant-garde art movements of the 1920s, constructivist design, architecture, photo montage. It brings that together with modernity, meaning more industrialism, which brings together transportation, communications forms, and labour. All those things are brought together once again in a kind of symphonic poem in this film. Now, I've said that Man with a Movie Camera presents itself as a film without a story, without a narrative. But of course it does have a narrative. It has a narrative frame, which is more like a topic or an organising theme. And that is a day in the life of a city, a day in the life of a city with all of its multitudes and its activities and its energies. But within that, of course, there's also an enormous amount of creativity, particularly on the levels of what is called a creative geography, in the sense that what we're seeing is, of course, not in fact one city. We're seeing parts of 4 different cities cut together: Moscow, Kiev, Yalta, Donbass, Odessa. There's 5 cities, and also we're getting, of course, things from all over many days cut together. And this was a freedom that Vertov and his collaborators celebrated, that they could sort of create the ideal day in the life of a city through this creative use of space and time. Let's also note that, contrary to what you might take to be the documentary aim of the film, there's an extraordinary number of effects work, as we now think of it, used in the film. Superimpositions, slow motion, backwards motion, animation makes a very important appearance later in the film. All of these different devices are being used creatively to enhance what Vertov wanted to do. It's interesting because he himself attacked, for instance, Sergei Eisenstein for using metaphors, parallelisms, symbolism, and using them in what Vertov thought was an overtly artistic, an excessively artistic way. But in fact, Vertov is no stranger to these things himself. Now, this brings us to say a bit more about a kind of theory of montage in this film. What kind of editing is this? What kind of montage is this? I think because we've seen films by Eisenstein, by Godard, we've seen Koyaanisqatsi by Godfrey Reggio, and many things, we think of montage as a question of clashing, of collision, of juxtaposition of different things, of a dialectic. So, you know, the old ways versus the new ways, the bourgeoisie versus the working class, the natural landscape versus the city, and so on. And it's too easy to fall into the trap of seeing Man with a Movie Camera as that kind of montage film, showing, for instance, the natural world of the workers with their peasant skills versus the bourgeois luxuries of women getting their hair and their nails done. But in fact, look at this. The nails that the women are getting done are compared to Yelizaveta Svilova scratching the emulsion of the film. Right? Now, that's not a juxtaposition as in one is good and one is bad. It's not a valuation of one over another. In fact, what I think Vertov is really aiming for is to equalise things, is to build bridges between these diverse aspects of Soviet life in the 20s. Now, I'm very much inspired here by the work of the American scholar John Mackay, and his whole line on Vertov is precisely this idea. He says, Vertov, I believe, tries to bridge the gap between bodies and machine rhythms, and between proletarians and non-proletarians like himself, through a kind of rhythmic organisation of sense data, visual, sonic, that will enable the multitude to emerge, at least on the level of perception. This organisation is both musical, that is high cultural, and mechanical, that is proletarian at once. So there's a lot packed into that statement by Mackay, and we'll work through some of it. But I absolutely agree with him, and also with the French philosopher and frequent commentator on cinema, Jacques Rancière. In his book, Intervals of Cinema, there's a wonderful essay where Rancière compares, of all things, Hitchcock and Vertov, Vertigo and Man with a Movie Camera. And this is the way Rancière evokes this film. He says it's the place where there are energies that constitute the truth of a world made manifest. He refers to the editing of the film as constructing a universal keyboard that enables the universal communication of movement. He says there's no separation between, for instance, the supposed artifice of, women beautifying themselves and the, authentic truth of the labourers in the fields, that in fact these things are made equivalent. Rancière says all movements are equivalent when they can be connected with movements of analogous form and at the same speed. Okay, so this idea of joining things at the same speed, or as Vertov said, creating sort of relations, what he called intervals, in other words, passing from the rhythm of one thing to another. That's what he called a montage of intervals. And intervals, as I say, are not about separating things, not about comparing things in a judgmental way or in a didactic way. They're in fact about finding a moment of fusion, of similarity, and also in terms of the time relations in the editing, finding almost a simultaneous fusion. Now, there are incredible moments around this section of the film where the alternation of shots, the combination of shots on the editing table becomes so fast that, we're watching these single frames intercut of two different movements. This is a perfect example of this interval montage that Vertov theorised about. And at those moments, in a way, editing deliberately destroys itself. It disappears. It becomes a pure fusion of rhythms and of energies. Now, in many ways, the central image of the film, I believe, is the image of the telephone switchboard. This is something Rancière also places great importance in, that a switchboard is just something that connects. In John Mackay's terms, it's a pure medium, a pure a film, this film is a pure medium in that it connects things. It's like the connecting bridge between all manner of things, between classes, between the old world of Russia and the new world of Russia. So we have a very particular kind of utopia here. We have this utopia that's trying to, in a sense, obliterate what could be perceived as the differences, perhaps the difficult, the unworkable differences between different classes of people, between different sectors of society, between different activities or different skills, different kinds of labour in a society. In fact, everything becomes labour in this film. You know, labour is fun, and fun is labour. That's one of the main things that Vertov's trying to evoke. The spinning machine, a machine for spinning thread, which is in so many ways one of the central images of the film, like the switchboard, like the keyboard in the film. We have this image, and so many things in the film spin and turn, including, of course, as we mentioned, the camera itself, the camera crank itself, and the revolving doors, and many, many things in the film spin and turn. So this machine, which, as Andy Rector has commented, it's not even a machine for instance, making clothes out of fabric. It's about making the very material that is going to be used to make other things. In other words, it's a shot of the very means of production. It's a pure sort of materialist Soviet image in that sense. Now, in this part of the film, we can see this work of association or montage that constructs the whole movie, in that here we've got an amazing correspondence, relation between machinery and nature. Water, which in some sense is interacting with civilization because it's being dammed up, it's being controlled, it's being channeled, but also it's wild nature too. And we have sort of like the power of machinery, and here, for instance, in this shot, you know, the power of coursing water. This brings to mind the fact that Dziga Vertov was a huge fan of the poet Walt Whitman. And for instance, here's another extract from the manifesto titled We. Openly recognising the rhythm of machines, the delight of mechanical labour, the perception of the beauty of chemical processes, we sing of earthquakes. We compose film epics of electric power plants and flame. We delight in the movements of comets and meteors and the gestures of searchlights that dazzle the stars. Now, we've been watching an incredible sequence with the sort of smelting works, with fire, with flame. And it's important that Vertov sort of goes this far, and then it leads to this like amazing like orgasm of montage that we've just seen. It's like the extremes of nature and the extremes of mechanical production are brought together in Vertov's vision. It's interesting that the image of the spinning machine is also, of course, an image of the crowd, an image of the throng, and an image of vehicles, such as we're seeing now, you know, constantly passing, intersecting, and so on in their travels. It's important to note that apart from the woman who wakes up early in the film, there's really no indoors, there's no sort of interior domestic life in this film. Even that woman who woke up is not in a family, she's not even in a couple. And it's like you only wake up in order to get out, you know, to get out into the street. This is one of the ways that the film creates this very public image of a community, of a multitude. Now we've hit a very important moment in the film, which is when the machines stop. Work stops. The working day as such stops, and just as people sort of made themselves up to go to work, now they're making themselves up to go out, to enjoy themselves. John McKay makes the strong point about how in a sort of earlier notes format with a movie camera, an idea that Vertov reached and that he fixed on was the idea of holidays. to make a film about holidays, about leisure activities, about having fun and so on. And this became a crucial sort of node in the construction of Man with a Movie Camera. That now we're going to have, for instance, the scenes at the beach, and then later we're going to have this sort of club, sports club, leisure activities, culture club, where the citizens of this multitude get together and have fun. Now, I've mentioned this idea of sort of fun and labour, fun and productivity going together. Once again, this is the kind of thing that for some commentators, for some viewers, sort of casts a shadow when they think about what communism and its more totalitarian phases became. In other words, this absolute productivity that rules everything. Everything must be productive, including leisure time, including fun. Fun is not the break from work, it's everything becomes part of the social system and of the individual's sort of conformist obedience to that system. It reminds me of when the filmmaker Raul Ruiz discussed surrealism, the art movement of surrealism, and he said that when André Breton and other surrealists discovered Marxism, when they discovered Marx's theory, it derailed them so much that they even wanted to make the unconscious productive. They wanted to make dreams into a labour. They wanted to produce books out of their dreams, produce artwork out of their dreams, out of their sleep. In other words, so even sleep is not a break from productivity. Now, this can be a kind of a nightmarish image of, all life is work. And of course, many other movements, anarchist movements in political 20th century have said don't work, like get away from work, the value of laziness and so on. However, what Vertov's conception is very much this once again, this union of all of the parts of life. And here, there's an everyday aspect to it. This is not so much in this part of the film the idea of the, perfect electric man, which is once again a scary idea because, of course, we know what happens to those citizens in communism who didn't come up to the state of perfection, who were imperfect in various ways. They got shipped off to camps and various other horrific ends. They were sort of excluded from the social body, from the social multitude. But in this part of Man with a Movie Camera, we get a much sunnier sort of idea about this. Now, this part of the film is important, and it's also important in terms of what's going to come later, which is when we return to the movie theatre, where Vertov's own film will be playing. Here we have sport, and look at the way Vertov constructs this. He constructs it very much in a kind of a classical Hollywood way, in that it's all shot reverse shot. I thought this is all, of course, completely created in the editing. Whether these people were at this moment actually looking at these things is immaterial. He's created an action and a spectator, many spectators and many actions. The important thing in this, for me, is that it's like each spectator sees what interests them. They pick out what interests them. And not only that, they now see with a keen eye, right? These ordinary people sort of going off and watching sport. It's as if they see with slow motion. They see with freeze frame. They can see in all directions, they can reverse directions, and so on and so forth. So this is like an illustration of the fact that the human eye can be sort of brought up to speed with the powers of a keen eye. And this, as I say, will be capped off in the finale, the epilogue, in a sense, of the film. I haven't said much so far about the larger career of Dziga Vertov. At the very start, I quoted Godard saying that at the beginning of the century, he was a revolutionary artist. In fact, his work sort of really got going more around 1920, the beginning of the 20s. Before that, he had been involved in what was called the film train, sort of taking making and taking film around to various parts of Russia on a train. But his first newsreels, which were called the Kino Pravda, the Kino Truth, the Cinema Truth, these films of facts, documentary films in a certain way, that was all happening in the early 20s, 1922. He was making a Kino Pravda series. And before Man with a Movie Camera, there were a number of important works that he made, including A Sixth Part of the World in 1925, and The 11th Year in 1928. After Man with a Movie Camera, he also made several important works, including Enthusiasm in 1930 and Three Songs About Lenin in 1934. It's often considered his sort of final work, where he was still having some creative control, at least, was Lullaby in 1937. But Dziga Vertov was in a strange position in that his artistry, and we can see this in his published diaries and notes, his artistry, his artistic ambitions were extremely frustrated under the increasingly Stalinist regime. But at the same time, you know, he was still wedded in many ways to Soviet ideology, and in a sense he wanted to be a good Soviet citizen. He ended up really back where he started in terms of film work. He ended up editing Soviet newsreels. He died in 1954. His wife, Yelizaveta, outlived him by 21 years. And speaking of editing, I just want to put in a little note here. Now, here's a magic scene. What we're seeing in the reverse shot volley are the same shots of children that we saw earlier in the film on Yelizaveta Svilova's editing table. So this creates, across the whole length of the film, the association of editing with magic. That's very important in the film, that editing is a form of magic. And magic involves, of course, substitution, transformation in those tricks that the magician is performing there. And that, in a way, will lead us to the magic of editing and the magic of the camera in a sequence of animation. It's a very important scene of animation that's going to come later. Anyhow, I mentioned that Vertov died in 1954. I want to read a little bit of a text that appeared in 1953, the year before Vertov's death. It was probably a text that Vertov himself may not have even been aware of. There was a screening and a kind of one of the first historic rediscoveries of Man with a Movie Camera in France in 1953. And in the famous magazine Cahiers du Cinéma, a group of commentators, not the usual critics of Cahiers du Cinéma in that time, but a number of representatives of the very strong Cine Club or Film Society movement, got together to screen the film and to discuss the film in public. And there was a transcription of their discussion in the 1953 issue of Cahiers du Cinéma. The commentator Jean Michel, who was part of the Cine Club movement, this is what he says about the film in 1953, because all of the commentators were extremely surprised, amazed by this movie, which, as they confessed, they thought was going to be a rather boring, ideological lesson. And then they were amazed by the dynamism and the potency of the movie. This chap, Jean Michel, says, all these things in the film give it an extremely complex construction whose originality is such that we lack words to define it. There are different movements, there's a theme, but there's also a melody and its accompaniment. There's the guy behind the camera and the same guy in the camera. There's the eye in the camera, there's the camera in the eye, and then there's the camera itself. And there's more. The spectator-actor and the actor-spectator, their film and our film, and then us today, the other spectators of the film. And all of this with the greatest narrative clarity, where nothing in it weighs it down or is too posed. I really agree with that. That's actually a very beautiful description of the film by this chap, Jean-Michel, who history doesn't tell us much about him other than that he was part of the Film Society movement. It is a film that has a narrative clarity, even though, of course, it pretends to not have a narrative at all. And a lot of it comes from these editing relations of shot and reverse shot in this part of the film. I've talked a lot about associational montage, and a phrase that's used by the great Russian film theorist Mikhail Kaufman is very suggestive about the film. He says the film is a montage rebus. In other words, he refers to it as a somewhat cryptic film in which the montage phrases, the blocks, the themes, the ideas, of course, we have to find them, we have to pull them out of the film, we have to articulate them as viewers, as commentators. Let's underline the absolute novelty of this film, the daring of this film, to have no words other than the original titles at the very start of the film, no intertitles. This is an incredibly daring film. It's still daring today. Like a lot of people make film essays, audio-visual essays of all different kinds, but usually there's some reliance on language, whether it's written words, spoken words, a text to accompany the images and so on. And, Chris Marker, Godard, Arun Farocki, Agnes Varda, many people have done wonderful work in this sort of essayistic mode. But Vertov, in a way, was way ahead of all of them a long time ago by going this far. Now, Vertov himself had indeed used, he had experimented with titles, with intertitles, and he had a sort of a concept of the word image. In other words, the word is something graphically written on the screen that could be used as another visual graphic element, just the way that Godard did many years later. But here is a film where we have to grasp the connections. Some of them are very clear, some of them you have to watch the film many times, and also you have to be a bit inventive, you have to be a bit playful. But remember, Vertov probably assumed that people would only see this film once in 1929, thereabouts. So the film was giving you the experience of this rebus, of these associations, some of which go more into your unconscious than they register on your consciousness. It's one of the reasons the film remains so powerful, is that it's like it disengages itself into a kind of a database, as Lev Manovich said, in your head after you've seen the film, and its associations start to play. You start to see the connections between things. Now, here's an example. We've started to enter a part of the film which is all to do with these clubs, leisure clubs, which bring together, drinking, relaxation, leisure, with various kinds of activities, physical skills like shooting. Now, I want to focus on drinking, right, on intoxication. And as we've seen, the camera, Mikhail Kaufman's camera, sort of mimics being a bit drunk. Now, drunkenness is part of Vertov's vision. Near the start of the film, we saw, what seemed to be, people waking up in the streets, perhaps homeless people, but perhaps also, simply drunken people who'd had a great night at the beer hall. The film comes full circle in this way. I'm reminded of the words of the more contemporary Russian film director Kanevsky, who once said of one of his own films, a scene where a man wakes up with a hangover, with his face down in a puddle of water, and Kanevsky said, "Every Russian has woken up in this puddle." Well, that may be an overstatement, but it's this idea that that drinking, intoxication is part of life. It's part of the cycle, or the many cycles of life that this film traces. Now, here in this sequence to do with sort of the culture clubs, the activity clubs in Russia at the time, we have many references to to radio, to music being broadcast, and the playing of music. Now, music is central to the film, not only because it wants to be a kind of a work of visual music, so to speak, but for a reason that John Mackay points out. Mackay's idea, very persuasive, is that Vertov was quite inspired by a work written at the end of the 19th century, a work of social analysis by Karl Bücker, called Labour and Rhythm. And Bücher's idea was that work, as it had developed up to the end of the 19th century, before industrialism, was intimately connected with songs, with singing. His idea was that every kind of work had developed its own form of song that would be singing while they work. It's the Walt Disney, whistle while you work, but in a completely different context. And it's as if we can imagine the work influenced the construction of the song, and then the song sort of fed back into the rhythm and the performance of the work. John Mackay believes that this book, which was translated into Russian at the beginning of the 20th century, was an influence for Vertov, in that what Bücher's book ends up lamenting is that with the invention of machines, the link between song and work is broken, between rhythm and labour. It's broken. And in many ways what Vertov is doing in this sort of bridge-building and utopian way is to reconnect life and work to rhythm, to song, and in a sense to reinvent song, a new kind of song, for a new world, for a new age. Now, we've made a fantastic leap just recently in the film here back into the movie theatre, where Man with a Movie Camera is playing. Firstly, I want you to note, the screen, the image on the screen, of course, has been sort of matted in, superimposed into the image. It's not literally a simple documentary shot of people in a cinema watching Man with a Movie Camera. As a result of that, the cinema is very well lit. It seems very bright, this cinema. Now, that could have been a technical question, but it's also expressive because in many ways this is Vertov's dream, that, the spectator is in the light. The spectator, these audiences are alert. They can see each other as well as the film. They can interact. They can talk to each other. It's not the image of cinema as the dark space where you go into your subterranean unconscious and your solitude as a spectator. It's absolutely nothing like that. It's not that idea, which so often comes with the idea of cinephilia, that we lose ourselves in the dark and all of that kind of thing, and that the cinema is a space of secrets and so on. No, here it's more like a dream, once again, a dream that came out again in the 1960s when, for instance, Jean-Louis Comolli said that, a new radical cinema for a new spectator would be to have the lights on in the cinema, or to have them at least half on. And television for Comolli was the new sign of, that you could interact with image and sound, with audio-visual production in the light of day, or in your well-lit lounge room or whatever. You could have a more alert and critical relation to the things you're seeing and hearing. Now, at this part of the movie, of course, we're getting a kind of a whole re-edit here of Man with a Movie Camera itself. And we're getting a new set of relations, of shot-reverse-shot relations, between images in the film and images of the audience watching the film. Once again, I think it's an important part of this that Vertov sort of tries to particularise. It's like specific audience members see specific things that interest them, that appeal to them. And there's a lot of play in that sequence between, some women see something that they like in the film, some men see other things that they like in the film. There's a lot of alternations and differences between different spectators reacting in different ways, some solemnly, some laughing, and so on. It's what we call in the modern time audience-product bonding, which is a technique that Hollywood and the advertising industries of the West know very well. Is if you want to create a feeling around a film, a movie, a an advertisement, you stick an audience actually in the thing, like have an audience inside a movie watching something, like a singer, for instance. And it's like the real audience watching the film hopefully will identify with the audience inside the film, loving what they see, right? It's a way to try to bond the product with the audience. That's what it's called in modern marketing. Now, Vertov uses this very much, because he wants the audience to bond with him. He wants the audience to accept him and his experiments, to accept more generally film as part of the Industrial Revolution. He's really aiming for an audience product bonding, and in a wishful way. It's been pointed out, for instance, by the avant-garde filmmaker Arthur Cantrell, that, of course, there's wishful thinking here. You know, this audience, this packed house of, wonderfully exuberant people watching A Man with a Movie Camera is a fantasy, in that the film was not terribly successful at all and wasn't screened terribly widely, and certainly didn't meet this public response that not only Vertov hoped for it, but he actually materialised it. He actually sort of shows it as trying to anticipate the success of his own film inside the film itself. However, this wasn't to be. Of course, what happened to poor old Dziga Vertov is that within the whole sort of Russian infrastructure of bureaucracy and government and commissions and so on, he was branded a formalist. And of course, what Vertov hoped for, which is that cinema would be taken as part of life and as part of the new movements of the 5-year plan, his hopes there were dashed. He was seen to be an elitist, to be a formalist. Like, this word still has, the ring of doom when we call an artist a formalist. We mean that, they're navel-gazing, they're playing with their materials, they're not meeting the public responsibility of, telling a story with relatable characters and reflecting the world as it is, or whatever may come with those kinds of official edicts of official culture. And so Vertov was, in a sense, sort of cast out from the extreme point that he had reached with Man with a Movie Camera. We're approaching the end of the movie, and we're reaching another one of these fantastic crescendos of the editing. The eyes of the editor, the strip of the film, the multitude, the throng, the movements, the beam of the projector, the clock, the switching circuits of traffic, all of it's coming together in an amazing statement, an amazing montage statement. And as the eye closes, I'd like to end with these words of Chris Marker. Ideas achieving equality with facts, art achieving equality with life. How do you say that in Russian? Dziga Vertov.